Every single day, she wakes up inside a cell and carries the weight of two names she can never escape. Dominic Russo, Davion Flanagan. Two young men who got into a car one night in the summer of 2022 and never came home. And the woman behind the wheel is now serving 15 years to life inside an Ohio state prison, with her last legal lifeline completely destroyed. Not by a judge, not by a jury, but by a single day on a calendar. Today, we are going inside what her life actually looks like right now, what the prison records reveal, what the courts have finalized, and why this case continues to raise deeply serious questions that do not have easy answers. Stay with us all the way through, because this story goes much deeper than the headlines ever told you. If this is the kind of thorough, fact-based true crime content you have been looking for, hit that subscribe button right now and join the DAV Crime Records community. We break down the verified facts behind the most complex cases every single week, and we are just getting started. Before we talk about prison routines, court records, or legal deadlines, we have to start in the right place. And the right place is not with Mackenzie Shirilla. The right place is with the two young men whose lives were permanently taken on July 31st, 2022, in Strongsville, Ohio. Dominic Russo was 20 years old. He had his entire adult life ahead of him. He was deeply involved with Mackenzie Shirilla in what court records and communication evidence later described as an intensely volatile relationship. But whatever the nature of that relationship, Dominic was a person with a future, with people who loved him, and with everything still to experience. That future ended in a matter of seconds. Davion Flanagan was 19 years old. He was a passenger in the back seat of that vehicle. He was not romantically involved with anyone in that car. According to testimony presented during the trial, he was simply catching a ride that night, sitting in the back seat with his seatbelt unbuckled. He had no conflict with the driver. He had no warning of what was about to happen. Davion Flanagan got into the wrong car on the wrong night, and that was the end of his story. When Davion's mother delivered her victim impact statement during the proceedings, she described her son as simply a good kid. Those words carry a kind of quiet devastation that no legal argument can touch. He was a good kid who happened to get into the wrong car. That sentence should sit with you throughout everything that follows in this story, because it never stops being true regardless of what the courts decided about anyone else. Dominic's family carried a different kind of grief. They had to process the loss of their son in a crash that involved someone he was personally and deeply connected to. That added layer of betrayal and confusion does not make their pain more or less than Davion's family. It makes it different in a way that is almost impossible to articulate. Two families, two sons, two permanent, irreversible absences at every dinner table, at every holiday, at every milestone that will now pass without them. The court acknowledged that suffering throughout the entire legal process, and we are going to acknowledge it throughout this entire story, because Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan are not a footnote in the Mackenzie Shirilla case. They are the reason the case exists at all. Now, to understand exactly how we arrived at where things stand today, we have to walk through what the evidence actually showed and what the two opposing sides did with that same evidence in court. The crash happened in the early morning hours of July 31st, 2022, in a business park area in Strongsville, Ohio. Strongsville is a suburban city in Cuyahoga County, located southwest of Cleveland. Mackenzie Shirilla was driving a 2018 Toyota Camry. Dominic Russo was in the vehicle. Davion Flanagan was in the back seat. The car collided with a solid brick building at the end of that business park. Both Dominic and Davion died as a result of the crash. Mackenzie Shirilla survived. The Strongsville Police Department launched an investigation. What they found inside that vehicle changed everything. Modern vehicles are equipped with an event data recorder, commonly called a black box. This device tracks and stores critical information about what a vehicle is doing in the moments leading up to a crash. It captures speed, throttle position, brake application, and steering inputs. The data extracted from Mackenzie Shirilla's 2018 Toyota Camry became the absolute centerpiece of the prosecution's case. According to the data pulled from that recorder, the vehicle was traveling at 100 miles per hour through the business park. To put that into perspective, at 100 miles per hour, a car covers the length of a football field in approximately 2 seconds. The accelerator was pressed to 100% of its capacity, and the detail that the prosecution returned to again and again throughout the trial. There was zero brake application recorded at any point leading up to the moment of impact. Not a partial press, not a tap, not even a fraction of brake pressure. The vehicle accelerated at full capacity and struck the wall without any attempt to slow down. The prosecution did not stop at the black box. Investigators also presented surveillance footage they obtained from the area, which they argued showed Mackenzie Shirilla driving through that same business park route in the days prior to the crash. The state's argument was direct and unsparing. She was not just familiar with the area, she was deliberately scouting it. She knew the layout, she knew the wall was there, and she returned with passengers and drove into it at full speed. Prosecutors also submitted text messages and social media communications pulled from Mackenzie's phone and accounts. That digital record painted a picture of a relationship between her and Dominic Russo that had grown severely toxic, marked by intense arguments and threatening exchanges. The state used that history to establish motive, to give the court a reason that connected the relationship breakdown directly to what happened at that wall. This was not presented as a case of a teenager making a terrible mistake behind the wheel. The prosecution presented this as a premeditated act carried out by someone who had a specific target, a specific location, and a specific intent. The case was tried as a bench trial, which means there was no jury. The decision rested entirely with one person, Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Judge Nancy Margaret Russo, in a detail that underscores just how seriously she approached her responsibility. Judge Russo took the extraordinary step of personally visiting the crash site during the proceedings. She walked the road, she examined the layout, she stood where the vehicle traveled and looked at the building with her own eyes before rendering any judgment. After reviewing the event data recorder evidence, the surveillance footage, and the communication records, Judge Russo ruled that Mackenzie Shirilla acted with specific intent to cause the deaths of the people in that vehicle. In her ruling, Judge Russo stated from the bench that what occurred was a mission of death. She convicted Mackenzie Shirilla of multiple counts of murder, not vehicular manslaughter, but murder, and sentenced her to 2 concurrent terms of 15 years to life in prison. Her first parole eligibility date is set for 2037. But the trial record does not exist in isolation, and responsible coverage of this case requires presenting what the defense argued with the same factual seriousness. Mackenzie Shirilla's defense attorney stood before the court and offered a fundamentally different explanation for the exact same evidence. The defense maintained that this was a catastrophic, out-of-control accident. Their argument was that Mackenzie Shirilla did not intend to harm anyone in that vehicle, and that the tragedy resulted from a young, inexperienced driver losing control under extreme stress. To counter the black box data, the defense retained their own crash reconstruction expert. That expert presented the theory of pedal misapplication. This is a documented phenomenon in accident reconstruction that occurs when a driver, in a moment of sudden panic, reaches for the brake and mistakenly presses the accelerator instead. The defense argued that Mackenzie lost control of the steering. The tires made contact with a curb, and in the resulting panic, she went to brake and pressed the wrong pedal, sending the accelerator to the floor. On the surveillance footage, the defense offered an equally straightforward counter. Driving through a familiar area before the crash was not evidence of planning a murder. It was simply a young person driving through a part of town she already knew. The defense argued that the prosecution had transformed ordinary, explainable behavior into evidence of premeditation. The defense also leaned heavily on the question of age. Mackenzie Shirilla was 17 years old at the time this crash occurred. Her family and legal team argued that the developing brain of a 17-year-old does not process a sudden, high-speed loss of vehicle control the same way an adult brain does. The panic response, the confusion, the failure to react correctly, all of it, they maintained, was consistent with an adolescent driver in an uncontrollable crisis. At the core of the defense's argument was the legal distinction between murder and vehicular manslaughter. Vehicular manslaughter, under Ohio law, generally covers situations where reckless or illegal driving, including excessive speed, results in death, but without the element of purposeful intent to kill. The defense argued that driving at a dangerous speed that resulted in a fatal crash, however tragic and inexcusable, did not meet the legal standard for purposeful murder. They believed the state had overcharged the case, and that the conviction represented a fundamental misapplication of Ohio's murder statute. The judge disagreed. The conviction stood, and then the legal process moved into its next phase. After sentencing, Mackenzie Shirilla's legal team began filing appeals. The case briefly returned to widespread national attention when streaming platforms and online platforms picked up the story, reigniting fierce public debate about intent, about adolescent culpability, and about whether the murder conviction was legally appropriate. Social media divided sharply. The arguments ran in every direction. But behind all of that noise, a critical legal event was unfolding. One that would permanently close every door that remained open for Mackenzie Shirilla. Her legal team filed a post-conviction petition seeking review by the Ohio Supreme Court. This was her highest remaining avenue of appeal. A successful review could have potentially led to a new trial or a reconsideration of her conviction. It was, effectively, her last real shot. The Ohio Supreme Court declined to review the petition, and the reason was not based on the evidence. The court dismissed the filing because it was submitted past the strict statutory deadline. According to reports, the defense team's filing arrived 1 day late. The reported cause was a miscalculation involving the leap year, an extra day in February that was allegedly not accounted for when calculating the filing window, pushing the submission exactly 24 hours past the cutoff. Ohio's court system does not grant exceptions for late filings. The rule exists, and it applies to everyone equally. When the deadline passes, the petition is dismissed. There is no grace period and no second opportunity. Imagine sitting inside a prison cell and receiving word that your one chance to have the state's highest court review your murder conviction is gone. Not because the court examined the evidence and ruled against you, but because a calendar calculation went wrong. That is the reality Mackenzie Shirilla woke up to. The appeal is dead. There are no remaining active legal proceedings. She is no longer a defendant fighting a case. She is inmate W111780, serving 15 years to life at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, Ohio, with her first parole hearing not scheduled until 2037. And while we examine what her daily existence looks like inside that facility, the most important thing to hold on to is this. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan do not have a daily existence to examine. They do not wake up. They do not have routines. They do not make phone calls or count down days or look forward to anything. Their families carry that permanent loss every single morning. The Russo family and the Flanagan family live with an absence that no court ruling, no appeal outcome, and no prison sentence can ever fill. Whatever discomfort or hardship exists inside those walls for Mackenzie Shirilla, it exists alongside a grief experienced by two families that has no end date and no parole hearing. When the courtroom doors close and the cameras stop rolling, a very different kind of story begins. No legal arguments, No appeals, no viral moments. Just concrete walls, mandatory schedules, and the suffocating weight of knowing exactly how many years stand between you and the possibility of freedom. This is part 2 of the Mackenzie Shirilla story, and what the records reveal about her behavior inside the Ohio Reformatory for Women raises serious questions. Not just about her, but about what justice actually looks like when the sentence becomes the daily reality. Before we go any further, though, we need to return to the 2 names that anchor everything in this story: Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan, 20 years old and 19 years old respectively, gone permanently on July 31st, 2022. Every single thing we are about to discuss, every conduct report, every disciplinary hearing, every question about rehabilitation and parole, exists in the shadow of the irreversible reality those 2 families have lived with since that night. Their sons do not get a daily routine. They do not get years to reflect and grow and change. The Russo and Flanagan families wake up every morning to homes that are permanently and irrevocably missing someone. That truth does not change, regardless of anything else this story covers. While Mackenzie Shirilla was still in Cuyahoga County Jail awaiting trial, prosecutors drew attention to something that revealed a great deal about how she was approaching her situation. On recorded jail phone calls that correctional facilities routinely monitor and log, she was captured using what became known publicly as the Carney Code. If you are not familiar with it, the Carney Code is essentially a form of spoken language manipulation where extra syllables are inserted into words in a deliberate pattern, making conversation difficult for listeners to decode quickly. The intent is to disguise the content of a conversation from anyone monitoring the call. She reportedly used this method to discuss her situation with family members and to attempt to manage her social media accounts from inside the jail, trying to give instructions without the monitoring staff catching on. From the outside looking in, it is easy to understand the impulse. She was a teenager who grew up in the age of social media, deeply accustomed to controlling her own narrative and her own digital presence. The idea of losing that control while sitting in a county facility waiting for a trial was clearly distressing to her, and she responded by trying to work around the system monitoring her. But what reads as a teenager's clever workaround in a county jail setting carries an entirely different weight inside a state correctional facility. Ohio state prison environments operate on an absolute foundation of security and control. Correctional officers are trained to identify manipulation, coded communication, and any behavior that attempts to circumvent the monitoring systems in place. When an inmate is flagged for attempting to bypass communication oversight, the staff does not treat it as a personality quirk or an adolescent mistake. According to standard correctional policy, that kind of behavior immediately marks an inmate as a potential security concern. The assumption in that environment is always that hidden communication involves either contraband or coordination with outside criminal activity. The consequence is swift, and it is significant. Communication privileges, including phone access and video visitation, can be suspended or permanently revoked. In county jail, losing phone privileges is an inconvenience. Inside a state prison serving a 15-year minimum sentence, losing your connection to the people you love on the outside is a form of isolation that compounds every other hardship of incarceration in deeply serious ways. There is another layer to her daily reality inside that facility that goes beyond the rules and the schedule. Because of the nature of her case, the intense media coverage, the Netflix documentary, the true crime community that debated her story across every major platform, Mackenzie Shirilla walked into the Ohio Reformatory for Women as a known face. Other inmates recognized her. They had seen the footage, watched the trial coverage, and formed opinions about her long before she arrived. In the outside world, that level of public recognition carries a certain kind of currency. On social media, name recognition translates to influence, to followers, to relevance. Inside a state prison, it works in the exact opposite direction. Notoriety in a correctional environment does not generate goodwill. It generates attention of a far more dangerous kind. When other inmates already know who you are before you arrive, it creates a set of social dynamics that are extraordinarily difficult to navigate. Some inmates may attempt to test her simply to see how she responds under pressure. Others may attempt to exploit her family connections on the outside, trying to manipulate her into having money deposited into their commissary accounts in exchange for protection or simply for peace. Still others may direct hostility toward her out of genuine anger about the nature of her case or out of the kind of deep social jealousy that concentrates inside closed institutions. She is not housed in a private cell with a steel door she can close and lock at the end of the day. The Ohio Reformatory for Women uses dormitory-style housing, meaning she shares large open living spaces with a significant number of other women. There is no retreat. There is no door. The noise, the tension, the social navigation, and the lack of any meaningful privacy are constant. Around the clock, every day of the week, with no option to step away and decompress. The facility's verified rules mandate strict uniform compliance. State-issued clothing is worn exactly as prescribed. It cannot be altered, adjusted, or customized in any way. Tablet access exists within the facility, but every message sent, every piece of media accessed, and every communication logged through that system is tracked and recorded by the security infrastructure. The individualism that defined her life before incarceration, the carefully curated online identity, the control over how she was perceived, the ability to speak freely and build an audience. None of that exists inside those walls. The environment is structured specifically and deliberately to eliminate it. Now, the public record goes beyond the environment itself. The Ohio Department of Corrections maintains official conduct documentation for inmates, and those records in Mackenzie Shirilla's case tell a detailed and significant story about how she has actually been functioning inside that facility. According to official public records from the Ohio Department of Corrections, she has accumulated 36 separate conduct reports since her arrival. Of those 36 reports, she was formally found guilty through internal prison administrative hearings in 32 of them. These are not informal verbal warnings from a passing guard. These are officially documented disciplinary proceedings with findings of guilt recorded in her permanent correctional file. The documented infractions cover a significant range of behavior. Prison authorities cited her for possessing contraband. In the general public's understanding, contraband often conjures images of weapons or drugs, but inside a correctional facility, the definition is far broader and the enforcement far stricter. The security economy of a prison depends on absolute control over what inmates possess. Any unauthorized item disrupts that control. In her case, reports indicate the contraband included unauthorized art supplies and items described as monopoly money. The specific items may sound minor in isolation, but the principle the correctional system enforces is not about the item itself. It is about the boundary violation and what unauthorized possession signals about an inmate's willingness to operate within the rules of the institution. She was also officially cited for altering her state-issued prison clothing. The impulse is psychologically understandable for someone who built a significant part of her identity around personal presentation and visual self-expression. But uniform compliance in a correctional facility is not about aesthetics. It is a fundamental security mechanism. Visual uniformity allows staff to immediately identify inmates, detect unauthorized items being concealed, and maintain the kind of instant situational awareness that keeps a facility safe. Altering a uniform is treated as a direct act of institutional defiance, and the records show it was documented as such. Additional conduct reports cited her for being out of place within the facility, meaning she was found in an area of the prison campus other than where her schedule and assignment required her to be. In a correctional environment, unauthorized movement is not treated as a minor navigational error. Every inmate's location is tracked against a designated schedule, and being found outside of that designated location triggers a security response. The records extend further into more serious territory. According to internal prison documentation, she engaged in unauthorized video visits with a former inmate. Direct communication with individuals previously incarcerated in the penal system is a clear and explicit violation of facility communication protocols. When that violation was identified, the records show she lost her phone privileges as a direct consequence. The one consistent thread connecting her to family and to the outside world was severed because the boundary around communication was crossed. The conduct documentation also includes formal citations for unauthorized physical contact with another inmate and allegations of sexual harassment directed toward correctional staff. It is critically important to state clearly that while these specific incidents are documented in her official Ohio Department of Corrections conduct file, they were handled entirely through the internal prison administrative process. They have not been adjudicated in any public court of law. The documentation reflects findings made by prison administration through internal proceedings, and that distinction matters for accurate, responsible reporting. What 36 conduct reports in a relatively short period of incarceration actually reflect, when examined through the lens of correctional psychology, is a profound and ongoing struggle to adapt to a system of total authority. Before the crash in July 2022, and during the period when she was released on bail prior to sentencing, Mackenzie Shirilla existed within a social framework that rewarded visibility, self-expression, and the ability to shape how she was perceived by an audience. She had a TikTok following. She had a public presence. She was accustomed to being seen and heard on her own terms. The attention, whether positive or negative, was something she understood how to navigate because she had grown up inside it. The Ohio Reformatory for Women operates on a fundamentally opposite logic. The institution does not respond to personality. It does not adjust to individual preferences or personal histories. The correctional officers overseeing her daily life are not concerned with how many views she generated online. Their sole professional focus is whether she is standing at her assigned location at 6 in the morning when count time begins. The system has absorbed her identity entirely and replaced it with an inmate number. The pattern of conduct violations reads, psychologically, as a series of attempts to exercise some form of control or agency in an environment designed to eliminate both. When you strip away every tool a person has historically used to assert their individuality and then place them inside an institution that responds to rule violations with tangible punishment, the behavior that emerges reflects the depth of that internal conflict. That is not an excuse for the conduct. It is an explanation grounded in what correctional psychology documents about the adaptation process for long-term incarceration. The 90-day mark carries particular psychological weight in the study of long-term incarceration. Researchers and correctional professionals have documented what is often called the 90-day wall, the point at which the initial survival mode response to imprisonment begins to break down. In the first weeks and months of a long sentence, the shock and stress of the new environment keeps the mind operating in a state of heightened alertness. There is so much to process, so many rules to learn, so many social dynamics to read, that the sheer volume of immediate demands prevents a deeper psychological reckoning with the long-term reality. Around the 3-month mark, that protective layer of distraction begins to dissolve. The routine becomes familiar enough that the brain no longer needs to devote its full attention to survival basics. And in that quiet, what sets in is the full weight of the timeline ahead. 90 days ago, Mackenzie Shirilla was still holding on to active legal hope. The Ohio Supreme Court petition was pending. The Netflix documentary had returned her case to national conversation. People across the country were actively debating whether she had been charged correctly, whether the murder conviction was legally sound, whether a new trial might emerge from the appeals process. There was noise surrounding her case, and noise contains within it the possibility of change. Today, the Ohio Supreme Court has issued its final word. The petition was dismissed. The documentary viewers have moved on to the next story. The comment sections have gone quiet. The legal avenues are completely exhausted. She is 20 years old, and she is looking at a minimum of 11 more years inside that facility before a parole board will even open her file for the first time. She will be 33 years old when that hearing occurs. Her entire 20s. Every year of the decade that her peers on the outside are using to build careers, form relationships, travel, and shape the direction of their adult lives, will be spent inside the Ohio Reformatory for Women, waking up at 6 in the morning for mandatory count, completing assigned labor for pennies per hour, and navigating the relentless social pressure of dormitory-style housing. And here is the reality of those 36 conduct reports in the specific context of 2037. A parole board does not evaluate an inmate based solely on the original crime. They look at the full behavioral record accumulated during incarceration. Every disciplinary finding, every conduct report, every instance where the rules of the institution were broken is part of the file they review. The board's central question is whether an inmate has demonstrated the capacity to follow the structured rules of a controlled environment, because if they cannot do that inside a facility with constant supervision, the board has serious grounds to question whether they can function within the laws of broader society. 32 findings of guilt through internal administrative hearings, accumulated in the early years of a 15-year minimum sentence, will not disappear from that file. They will be sitting in front of that parole board in 2037, and they will carry weight. There is a broader question this case has consistently raised in public discourse that deserves honest examination. During the trial and sentencing process, significant public attention focused on Mackenzie Shirilla's behavior on social media prior to and during the court proceedings. Video footage circulated widely. Public reaction was intense, and for many people, that reaction was driven by what they perceived as an absence of visible remorse. The important legal reality is that Judge Nancy Margaret Russo's conviction and sentencing were grounded in the physical evidence. The event data recorder, showing 100 miles per hour, 100% accelerator engagement, and zero brake application, along with the surveillance footage and the documented communication history. The judge's ruling was based on the legal standard for purposeful intent as applied to that evidence, not on public sentiment about social media behavior. But the question the case genuinely raises is whether the intensity of public emotion surrounding her online presence influenced the broader cultural conversation about the case in ways that complicated a clear-eyed evaluation of the legal arguments her defense presented. That is a question worth sitting with, not to relitigate the verdict, but to understand how public narrative and legal process interact in the age of viral true crime coverage. At the center of everything, when the legal analysis is complete and the prison records have been examined, what remains is a question that belongs to the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. The sentence has been handed down. The appeals are finished. The institutional doors are locked. But for the people who loved those two young men, there is no sentence that ends. There is no parole date for grief. There is no institution that contains the absence of a son, a brother, a friend who should still be here. The court centered the victims during sentencing, and that centering was right and necessary. When we examine the aftermath of a case like this one, the families carrying that permanent loss deserve to remain at the center of every conversation we have about what justice means and whether it was served. That is where this story stands today. Documented, finalized, and still carrying questions that do not resolve easily. If this breakdown gave you the full, factual picture you were looking for, please take a second to like this video. It genuinely helps more people find coverage that handles these cases with the seriousness and accuracy they deserve. And if you are not already part of the Dave Crime Records community, subscribe right now. We go deeper than the headlines every single week on the cases that demand real attention, and there is much more coming. Do not miss it.